Hey, let's get started. We have a lot on our agenda today. Great to see you all again in the new year, and we're going to be covering a lot of ground this morning. With our typical lake condition update, but then also I think there's a number of other things going on, just a few things going on that we want to get updates on. And then we're going to be moving into the salinity estimates and for this year, and talk a little bit about berm management over this next year, and then transitioning over to talk about concepts for the new flow control structure at the Union Pacific Bridge. So, anything else that if you had a chance to look at the agenda? Anything else that's pressing? I know legislature's in session, so there's always things that are pressing, but I don't know if there's any other issues this committee needs to talk about today.
No, if we could ignore the legislature for this meeting, that would be excellent.
We can do that.
Yeah.
Super. Well, I sent out to the committee members a summary of our meeting back in October 24. That seems like forever ago. But I wanted to see if there's any comments, any revisions that the committee would like to make. And if not, entertain a motion to approve. So moved. Thank you, Andrew. There's a second? I second. Thanks, Joe. All right. All those in favor of approving the summary, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Any discussion? All right. Well, approved. So I guess I forgot to go around the room. So we got a lot of visitors here today, and there's a number of folks online. So let's just go around the room and introduce ourselves. My name is Jeff DenBleyker. I work with Jacobs, but I'm the facilitator for the Salinity Advisory Committee.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
Joe Havasey, Compass Minerals.
Jake Alexander, State Lands.
Angela Gong, Great Salt Lake Program Manager, also with it.
Andrew Ropke, Utah Geological Survey.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
John Love, Wildlife Resources.
Bill Brown, Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative.
Adam Harris, Division of Water Quality.
Tim Moss, Brine Shrimp Cooperative.
Tim Davis, Deputy Great Salt Lake Commissioner.
Jennifer Biggs, Forestry, Fire and Stalins.
Will Johnson, University of Utah.
Georgie Parker, Great Salt Lake Institute, Westminster University.
And Holcomb, Division of Water Quality. Justin Mitchell, Morton Salt.
Travis Anderson, Morton Salt. Ryan Rowland, U.S. Geological Survey.
Wildlife Resources.
Rob Baskin, USGS retired.
Great. And then online, we have a number of folks. Brian Crookston with Utah State University. Christine's here already. Greg Miller with Water Resources. Elliot Jagnicki with UGS. Emily Hawley with Forestry, Fire and State Lands. Eric Dixon with Water Resources. Eric Stuckey, I don't know that I know you.
He's law enforcement.
I'm
great.
State Lands.
Great, thank you. Good to meet you. Glad you're here. Layla Mahdi with Water Resources and Rob Dubuque with Friends of Great Salt Lake. Did I miss anybody? We got everybody there. So thanks again, everybody, for coming. It's great to see all your faces again this year. Next on our agenda, I guess first on our agenda is just an update on lake conditions, and then I was thinking the salinity forecast or estimates we do
Later.
later.
Okay, great. You want to drive, Ryan?
So I'll just jump in.
All
Chrissy and I tag team this often, so we'll do our usual lake elevation and discharge update, and then Christine will jump in with the salinity update. Next slide. Okay, so on this graph, we're showing the daily water surface elevation at our gauge at Saltaire. That's the south arm gauge. So that's the blue line on the plot. And then we're also showing the data for our gauge for the north arm. That's saline. That's the red line on the plot. We're showing data from about 2017 to current. And again, it's daily water surface elevation on the y-axis from about 4188 to 4196. So just looking at the most recent data, the daily value at the south arm gauge on the 21st of this month was 4192.6 feet. That's up about 0.5 feet since the seasonal low measured at this gauge in November of 2024. The daily value at the north arm on January 21st was 4191.8 feet. And that's up about 0.4 feet since the seasonal low in November 2024. And you can see the lake elevation difference between the north arm and the south arm. We're sitting at about 0.6 feet. Am I doing the math right? 0.8 feet. And so that's the current status of the lake elevations at the lake at our long-term gauges. Next slide. And then briefly on the surface water inflow gauges, the cumulative flows. So on the y-axis, we have cumulative stream flow of millions of acre feet. It's a log scale on the y-axis, and we're showing data for a water year. So the current water year is shown on the plot with the bold black line, and then you're all familiar. The blue line is the highest ever measured cumulative flow. The yellow orangish is lowest. And then the interquartile range is the shaded green zone. And then the light gray line within that is the median. And so looking at the most recent data, the bold black line for Bear River near Corinne, Utah, you can see we're just below the median at that site right now. So hit the next button. So this is data, exact same type of plot for the Weber River near Plain City, Utah. So the bold black line showing the most current data is below the median, but we're within the 25th to 75th percentile range. Hit the next button. Same type of plot for the Goggin Grain near Magna, Utah. Bold black line here is well above the median. So that's great news. And then next button. And so this is the Farmington Bay outflow at the Causeway Bridge. And right now the bold black line is above the median at this site. So that's where we stand right now relative to the historic cumulative flow record for these stations. Moving on, as you all know, we measure discharge at the new breach. So this plot is showing discharge on the I know you can't see this very well, but just briefly, the y-axis is discharge in cubic feet per second. The x-axis is showing data from January 2024 out to current. And so the blue line on the plot are the instantaneous discharge values that came from the stage discharge rate we were able to establish at that site when we had, pretty much free flow over the berm. And so we have a good record of discharge for this period, a continuous record of discharge for this period that's available to you, the public, via INWIS. But in August of 2024, we kind of lost that free flow, and we had backwater effects at the site. So we're no longer able to use our rating to compute instantaneous discharge. So that's why that blue record ends. But we continue to make our monthly field measurements of discharge, the technician actually physically measuring discharge. We continue to do that every month. So the most recent monthly measurements of discharge in October 4th of 2024, we measured 823 CFS moving from south to north, and we're picking up some north-south flow now. And we got about 28 CFS moving from the north to south. You see the November 20 data, 829 CFS south to north and 30 CFS north to south. On December 5th, 803 CFS south to north and 36 CFS moving north to south. And then most recently on January 10th, 1,080 CFS moving from south to north and about 22 CFS running from north to south. So that's the most recent discharge information that we have. And then, as you know, we also measure discharge at the lakeside breach. This is the breach at the far west end of the railroad causeway. So we have a record of discharge at this site represented on this plot. from early 2024 out to the most current period. And once the lake levels dropped to I don't remember the exact elevation, but we basically lost flow at this site as we entered into September of 2024. The lake level is just too low for water to move from south to north. So the data from most of September to current is 0 CFS moving from south to north. And we have those field observations shown to the right to verify that. Okay, a little bit of sad news. One of our lake elevation stations, 100-127, which is located on the north side of the railroad causeway and over towards the west. It was a station that was mounted to an existing piling, a steel piling out there. And unfortunately, that piling collapsed on August 25th. So we lost about $10,000 worth of equipment. It was destroyed. We've looked at nearby pilings, existing pilings out there, and we just recently determined that there's just not going to be a way to use an existing piling to reestablish the site. So if we want to have a lake elevation station on the north side of the causeway, fairly close to the new breach, we're going to probably have to come up with funding to put in a new pilot. And that's going to run anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. It's not a cheap endeavor to have a piling driven by a commercial company to get that piling down deep enough where it's stable and we can reliably measure surface water elevation at that station. So we're kind of working on a plan B, which is plan A is a new piling. Plan B is we're talking to the railroad. Going to be talking to the railroad to see if there's any kind of a possibility they can drop some really big riprap on the north side of the causeway. Then we can mount a radar sensor to measure this water surface elevation. If they can do that, if we can do something like that, we might be able to get away from doing a piling. But I give that a small chance. The most optimal thing here would be to install a new piling. This is something that needs to be considered as the new breach design evolves, and that'll inform the necessity of having a potentially new piling.
Was it wave action that took us down, or was it corrosion?
Yeah, it was an old piling. Yeah.
Ryan, do you know how quickly something can be installed? Like, if something happened this fiscal year, for our fiscal year by July?
So it depends on what the outfit can do. I think we talked to Fish Tech was a company, and it just depends on how quickly they can mobilize and how quickly we can get funding lined up.
There may be some capacity this year if we were to do it before.
Okay, so I think it would be wise to put in a new pilot.
I agree. Yeah.
And then quickly an update. As you all know, we're installing new stream gauges as a part of various agreements, but the main one that is related to Great Salt Lake is an agreement we have with the Bureau of Rec that was in the news recently. That agreement has 14 new stream gauges as a part of it. We've already got 7 of the gauges installed, so they're shown here by the red arrows. We have more work to do, but we're working through that list diligently. Getting permits can be time consuming to get these in, so that's one reason why all the gauges aren't already in. Next slide. That just shows the list of gauges we're working on. The red check marks indicate that gauge is already installed. A few of the gauge locations are fluid right now, so they may not mesh up exactly with what you see on this table when all is said and done. I'm not going to go into the stories, but we're working with Division of Water Rights, Water Resources, Utah State to identify the most optimal sites to make sure that everybody's getting the big bang for the buck on these inflow gauges. All right, that's it for me. Any questions for me? Thanks.
So actually, Farmington Bay,
Yeah.
those flows were among the highest ever recorded. What's going on? What's changed?
Wait, when will
The
this?
Farmington Bay outflows
Yeah, what would you?
are up on that uppermost curve right now, or they have been.
Oh, So that plot's a little bit, let's go back to that, the cumulative flow plot for Farmington Bay. So right now the bold black line is in this 25th to 75th percentile range. They are near, for this time of the year, the highest ever measured cumulative flow at this site at this time of year.
Okay.
And
But the highest cumulative is
the
not
highest,
reflective of the early part of the year.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
This is a little bit of a Chinese puzzle. No, I shouldn't say that. Tongue twister of a plot.
50,000 strawberry too.
I think that's what it is. It's an artificial.
This highest ever cumulative measured flow in blue, it means this at this point that was the highest ever measured cumulative flow. Back here, it may not have been. So
Would that have been attributed to the truss of the water? that's been
Yeah, it's
released?
that release out of Utah Lake. Well, there's two things going on with the Jordan right now. There's Central Utah is discharging water from Strawberry down to Utah Lake, and then that's going further down. And then there was the 10,000 that the trust secured as well. So which of that is how you break those out down the Jordan? I don't know right now, but there are those two different things that that appear on this on those two graphs. So,
Yep. That's great to know, because I think it's great for Great Salt Lake. I drive over Jordan River every day, and it's unusually high this time of year. So it's good to see the water moving.
Real quick, Ryan, is there a measurement at Lakeside for, is there any flow north to south? I know it was 0 the other way, but when I was flying, I could see water coming from the west. And looked like it was going back.
So we know there are periodic flows that run from north to south at the lakeside gauge, but we're not capturing those as well as we would like to. The rating that we have developed for this site is only for south to north flows.
Okay.
So there's times in the spring and maybe big storm events that are bringing water from the north through that lakeside causeway to the south, and we're not quantifying that right now.
Okay, I was just making sure because I could see it and I didn't know if there was a way that you had to do that.
Yeah. That gets really tough. It requires that we have an in situ velocity sensor, so it's up looking and measuring velocity in the water column. But if the water is really shallow, can't really do that very well. And so we just can't. Okay. At low lake levels, we just can't monitor that very accurately. When the water levels are higher at that site, then we will report negative flows at that site, which indicate north to south flows. But right now, we're just can't do that.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Any other questions? Sure.
Okay, so there's just a couple of slides on there's conditions of salinity in the South Arm. This is from Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program data. The most recent data we have are from January 15th. As you can see, the most recent measurements range from about 98 to 120 grams per liter, and 98 being at our site 2267, which is near the inflow of where the Bear River comes in. We had our seasonal high last October in 2024. And relative to that high, we're down about 4 grams per liter in Gilbert Bay and down 7 grams per liter in Carrington Bay. And then just quickly looking at kind of our historical record back from 2010 to present, current conditions, we're kind of hovering around that 120 gram per liter, as I mentioned. And this is kind of similar to conditions in 2017 or so when we were near there and still had dilution, ahead of us in the spring. So somewhat similar to that. And then I'll just point out there are a couple of other measurements we have on January 8th at the new breach. That was 118 grams per liter. And at Saltaire on January 16th, it was also 118 grams per liter. So sitting right around there, and expect things to continue diluting through the spring. So I'll leave it there and we can jump back to salinity later.
Christina, I have a question. and I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but with the bidirectional flows, do we have any idea what the difference in salinity of the north versus the south directional flows?
What the salinity we have coming in is around 100, or it's about 270 grams per liter.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Do you have Christina, update on the mineral extraction study?
Yes, I talked to Scott yesterday. He's the guru head honcho on this one. So we met with Morton. We're trying to wrap our brain around kind of the inflows or the locations of effluent, digging into the Division of Water Rights database, I guess, and trying to wrap our brains around water rights that exist for different mineral companies. Talking to Morton is very helpful to just wrap our brains around how their operations work and things we should be considering. And then big picture, Scott's really trying to think of the salt and water balance that we've been developing for years, adding in the mineral extractive processes, but also in the context of a regulatory framework. So how we can link the actual measurements we have of effluent, discharges, concentration to water rights, to paper water versus real water. So he's kind of thinking big picture about how we connect those two dots. We're hoping to visit Morton and get an idea of their operations so we can get an understanding of how the whole process evolves from freshwater inflows through their operations infrastructure, and then how that would affect the lake. So that would help us, to just see that on the ground and see how these things work. So that's in progress of setting that up. And then we're also interrogating the discharge at the new breach in the context of different Berm scenarios and our ability to measure with accuracy. And so that piece of it is key, but quantifying salt fluxes there so we can compare that to the salt fluxes occurring due to mineral extractive activities. So multiple things happening along that front, and then also trying to engage with the comprehensive management plan meetings so that we can understand that regulatory framework and the big picture of what all these different entities are operating under. So we can just kind of keep it relevant and provide useful information. So that's kind of the update I have there on that in progress.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Any questions? Christine?
Just a general question. Is US Magnesium doing any withdrawals at this point of water?
I don't know. Sorry, I'm not sure.
I believe they are still withdrawn. At least as of November, their pumps were on and running, but I haven't been out there.
But there's another point related to that is the long-term closure plan for the retrofitted waste pond around the footprint of US Magnesium calls for a salt cap. And that may actually be a significant impact on the salt balance, depending on where that's drawn from. And so it's worth keeping an eye on. It's a ways out, obviously, but yeah, significant.
Great. Well, Ben, I have some updates.
I don't have much to update. I would have, other than just, we're underway with the plan. There's a lot of big things happening in that regards. We had a great deal of work over the holidays with Morton and other companies to complete some voluntary agreements. So we now have voluntary agreements with Morton, Compass, North Shore, and Earth Elements. So we're really pleased. I know Cargill is eager to figure something out with us, and we're really excited to figure that out as well. But there's some complexities being that they don't do that local water rights. So we're good with Cargill's engaged in that discussion. Having some discussions as well. Certainly did that on some other issues as well. But for the most part, I'd like to see the time that we put on the agenda for me to make sure we have enough time to discuss the DWQ rulemaking. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, that's next.
Okay.
All right, Jim.
So just to give an update, I'm trying to think where we were last time we met with this group and what I updated you all on. But last fall we had started drafting our rules and met with our work group, members of this group. Since then, we've done some outreach. Tim has been gracious enough to do some outreach to the legislature to make sure we were capturing their intent in the rule. And we arrived at another
draft, which I can kind of give a brief overview of, and we met on this just this Monday. Essentially, putting a prohibition on any discharges to the lake when the lake is over 150 grams per liter. And it also has a provision in there where the director, at the director's discretion, if it's getting close to that 150, we also have the ability to make sure that we're forecasting and ensuring that a discharge does not put it over that limit. And then there's also a provision at the director's discretion, as it is written now, that allows for de minimis discharges to the lake. So we're working on crafting what does de minimis, and I can come back to this. Well, I guess we can talk about it right now. Crafting exactly what does de minimis mean. It may be something that we rely on this group for, and that's something of an ask that we may want to come back to this group, maybe in an interim meeting, because we don't have a lot of time to obviously discuss all the details of that, because it could be a long discussion. But crafting a de minimis clause that allows for a small discharge that does not appreciably change the concentration of the lake. And so how that gets defined is still yet to be determined. I think Ben brought up a good idea where we might develop a matrix, which is based on some of the forecasting that's being done, that kind of maps out those situations, lake level, lake volume, concentration. That so the idea being that I think we heard from the permitted community that they want some certainty, they want some an approach that's tenable, that they know what they're working with. So we'll be working on that, as well as a guidance. That was another thing we heard in Monday's meeting, was having an associated guidance document to go along with these rules that explains a lot of this and how we're going to implement it, the applicability and all of the provisions, and how it works into the permitting process. So again, for certainty for the permitting community. So, Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Can talk through the next steps in our process.
Oh yeah, next step. Sorry. So schedule. We're hoping that if we could vet with the sub-work group some tweaks to the language to by the end of this month put out a version for informal public comment. We'll be working with our board to work on the schedule, but the idea being that we would like to have it published April 1 in the register, so that it can for formal public comment after going to our board in late March. There will be a 30-day public comment period, after which we'll take the time to hopefully not have to have any significant changes that would require another round of public comment. But the idea is to get this finished by the end of June. 1st of June. The 1st of June. Yeah. I thought it was the end of June. Oh, okay. So that's tight schedule.
Do you mind if I
Yeah.
add something to that? I think one of the discussion points that we had was just, in defining de minimis, I think that this body would be able to, I guess, more accurately or easily define, what that could entail. And I think we all would probably agree it's like not a one size fits all solution, right? Like each year, de minimis might be a little different. Where at, record low lake levels, really high salinity levels, every gram matters, right? But when the lake is high, someone discharging, a million tons of salt, it's not going to move the salinity at all. And it perhaps is not even a problem. I'd say like today, we're at a really good salinity level, and de minimis, could probably mean that, companies could operate as normal or not have a large impact, where we're not actively trying to export salt to the North Arm as we were a couple of years ago. So one of the ideas that we threw around, but I don't want to put the salinity committee on the hook to do these things, is that perhaps, at a certain time frame each year, like we have June 15th that shows up in the statute a lot about like lake levels and conditions that determine how companies might use their water rights moving forward. That's a kind of a basis for some of those agreements. And that perhaps that could be another thing that the Salinity Committee does is have an estimated salt balance, perhaps weighed with the current concentration, and then being able to make some ratio determination about what does de minimis mean for this coming year. And then each year that would give the operators some idea about, in conjunction with the voluntary agreements or their water rights, what do they need to do with their operations so they can, make sure that they know for the coming year, what could be discharged. Because this is, what it boils down to is, I think through the process, Jim and Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, that what we determined is, most of these discharges probably are not moving the needle on salinity at all in a given year. And I think there's really very few times where we're, hitting rock bottom where every gram does count. But when we're there, we really need the companies that are discharging to be able to step up and help us to achieve those salinity goals on the south island. But we also recognize there's a lot of companies doing a lot to try to protect the lake. So we want to make sure we're, balancing the needs of industry with the needs of the south arm salinity levels. So that was kind of maybe a adaptive approach to trying to set these limits. So anyway, I guess what I'm asking is does the Salinity Committee feel that would be an appropriate use of the committee to be able to, look at lake levels, estimated salt mass, and try to make a determination in the year about, what de minimis might be, for that year? Or does the Salinity Committee feel like we shouldn't be stepping in anything by going that direction and defining that? I don't think we need a vote or anything. It's more of just to understand if anybody on the Salinity Committee feels like that's not the, within the role of the committee or that we shouldn't be involved in that.
Joe, the perspective as an operator.
Maybe if I could have a step back, just so it's sort of clear the different discharge profiles. You have the normal plant site discharge. So if you're processing materials, you have every industrial commercial facility is going to have a UPD's permit, a discharge, and that's a much lower profile. The salinity of those kinds of discharges is going to be lower, smaller volume. So de minimis kind of in the context we're talking about is more of sort of plant site. And plant site is important from a day-to-day, operation standpoint. Now, Compass Minerals, we do what we call mineral return, where we have our evaporation ponds and we have salt accumulation in certain ponds that aren't mechanically harvested. So we implement mineral return to dissolve the salt right about now, from November to March, dissolve the salt and then discharge that back to the lake. And that's a long time operation that we've done. I don't want to say that's an elective, but when we're south of 4190 and we're in sort of 2022 sort of territory, that could be something that can be sort of delayed and not essential from a day-to-day operation standpoint. And that's going to have a larger profile in terms of the salt contribution. What I'll also volunteer though is when the lake is at 4189, one of the reasons is at 89 is because the bear is like minimally flowing. So you're naturally going to reduce your mineral return anyways because of water availability. But those are the two different profiles. Amongst kind of a small working group for this role, we keep kind of coming back to we should be looking at mass load in the lake, as a kind of a data point to inform what is de minimis, what would be a nominal contribution to the mass load. And I know Christine presented that in October. It was like 905 million tons, if I recall. But that's going to be an important data point. And that's with the new bathymetric data that we have, as well as having lake elevation, that's a knowable number. Especially based on our the sampling that's done in the South Arm. So that would be kind of in my mind sort of the benchmark figure to determine kind of setting a limit in terms of the allowable contribution.
And maybe just to make sure, Morton's situation is also recognized, the companies like Morton don't have the capacity to, like, they're taking it, they're precipitating out the sodium chloride and that's sending everything back. And so they don't have the ability to hold brines for a given year. And I think the intention of this was, not to put this on, Compass, but I think that one of the intentions is that when the state's actively trying to export, salt to the North Arm, and then, with Compass's operation, it's, primarily collecting salts from the North Arm that end up in the beds of the ponds in the South Arm that get returned. So it almost, in a way, I think there's some optics that it undoes some of the work that we're trying to do at the breach. So I think what Compass has agreed to in the voluntary agreements largely addresses a lot of that because, they're scaling down operation as we get to these points of low lake levels and high concentrations. But I think this is where, when Compass has the flexibility, they've been great in the past to be able to say, yeah, we can hold off for a couple of years while we deal with the salinity crisis. But now, we have a rule on the books and we need to, DWQ can't just not do the rule. So we're trying to find a solution where it's, very clear what the state is working on doing, which is to reduce the salt load, when salinities are high, and provide the, certainty, the regulatory certainty for companies like Morton that don't have the ability to idle operations that way, but also they have agreed to do that through their cooperative or their voluntary agreements. So I think it's a lot of things happen since the bill was written. So we're trying to find a way that's like meaningful, that does have some teeth to it, and exemplifies the work and commitments of the companies that have already been done, but also, doesn't unnecessarily, penalize someone for something that they've already done a lot to improve the situation on. Again, like I said, Morton Salt has agreed, similarly to Compass, they donated some of their water rights, but also has agreed that, below 4190, they're not depleting any more brine. So, if we hit 4189 again, we're in a scenario where they're not going to be discharging, salinity for the most part, other than some maintenance of their pumps. So anyway, I think that's the point is like, I think our body could easily say, here's the estimated salt mass, here's today's salinity, what could de minimis be? And it could be some fraction of, the 905 million tons. And then we could determine, what that.
So one other figure that needs to be determined, and I know, we have these data, for what the salinities were in the last measurement, but establishing kind of this process will need like a headline salinity. Like, how do we take the 6 to 9, 12 values that we have and come up with a headline salinity? What's relevant? So obviously we have that data, but how what's your averaging strategy to determine that? So that's impactful to how this rule would work.
This is really kind of a piece of that long-term salinity management plan that we've been moving toward. What salt loads can we manage? What salt loads can't we manage? What should we do at different decision points?
And the way this rule is written, it does rely heavily on this group to provide definitions for both de minimis as well as what is salinity for the lake. So that salinity value essentially implies, as you outlined, what unique value are we going to be utilizing, and how do we arrive at that value? What are the methods? What are the field methods? Which one of the data points through the water column are we accepting for that average, etc. So a lot of intricacies that we'll rely on this group and their expertise for.
And I think that our charter definitely lines up with being able to like set those kind of standards or some of those definitions, because like in the past, if you look at like 5 years ago when this committee was first formed, we didn't have the right protocols for even just reporting salinity or measuring it. And those things have adapted to the point where we're at now. And now I think we've evolved a lot, but there's still these little pieces of the puzzle that I think again, I don't think there's another body that could do it. I think this is the place for it. But again, I feel like the committee needs to want to do it.
And that history, precisely why we didn't put things that were too prescriptive in here, because of the change that could occur in terms of how we, as a group, are monitoring and assessing that.
So I think I'm just thinking about our committee schedule. we were targeting 4 times a year, and our next meeting would be in June 23rd. So it's too late. That would be too late to provide any input as a committee. So I think I don't see any heads shaking. I see heads kind of nodding. So I guess, does anybody have any concerns about that? I think what it would require is we would need to have some additional meetings here in the next couple months. And I know you have a working group, and a number of people on this committee are participating in that. But I think that's more of an informal, voluntary group. Just so I guess is there any concern with adding some additional meetings here in the next few months to where this group can focus on?
And I might even suggest as well, Jeff, if we thought that it needed more than one official meeting, perhaps we could even have a working group of folks that are interested to bring back to the committee and just have one additional meeting with the committee, just to make sure that those that, aren't super interested in diving into the weeds don't have to do so.
Yeah, I was thinking if that was amenable to the group, I understand you were all busy, maybe sometime early February, where we can have the results of our initial round of informal comment. I know it's kind of arcane information, so it's probably the people around this table who would actually comment, but that's what the nature of what it is. And then we'll have a better idea of what universe of changes we'll have to face.
Are there any concerns with doing that? I think I'm not hearing any. So I think, I guess what I would propose is that we do set up a working group meeting for, I guess February is just a week, almost a week away now.
I'm sorry. I meant early March. Sorry.
Early March. Okay.
After the. Yeah.
Okay. But I think to get a working group scheduled, perhaps mid to late, I don't know, in a month time frame from now. And then what we can do is, I think traditionally, we've had a meeting in Salinity committee meeting in April after the legislative session's done, where we're had an update on runoff, and we have kind of an idea. So that might be a good time where does that fit with your, it's April 1st is the official comment period starts. So I don't know, maybe we need to, I don't know, let's talk. I like the idea of having a working group where we can.
Should we just take volunteers to be on the working group now, so we can establish that? And Jim, maybe you can find a time between now and our March meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you just want to raise your hand if you want to participate, and get the names down.
This side of the room is it.
I do have questions for you about something else.
Right.
Okay. Craig said yes. That I don't have that. You guys, Ryan, Christine.
I think Andrew Rubke said he wanted to as well.
It's a definite maybe.
Yeah, I think a couple of DWR guys were interested, but I don't know.
John, you're
Not
also
sure.
interested in
Some
more
people
meetings,
move over to this side of the fence. I saw people move over to this side of the room.
Jim Bryan sits down.
right?
Oh, it looks like Brian Cripston online as well. Would be interested.
Craig Miller had his hand up.
Come here, then again.
Speak, Alexander.
Jake. And I apologize, on our update, I should have introduced Jake. He's our new minerals operations manager, so he's going to be overseeing that for us in the future, so I can push a lot of what I do on Jake.
Yep. Yeah, I think, it strikes me there's a lot that's going on where this fits into, and with the mineral extraction study, trying to quantify these things, the modeling, the salt balance modeling, the hydrology modeling, the flow control structure, the ongoing monitoring of inflows to the lake. There's all of this is connected. And I think we're definitely moving the ball forward and understanding all of those different pieces and trying to figure out how testing to see how they fit together. And meanwhile, the agencies have to write rules and to anticipate what a long-term plan might look like.
So, yeah. Will just also add all of these moving pieces, the voluntary agreements, the salinity management, the berm, engineering analysis. I think this all plays into the long-term management of our, with our mineral leasing plan and our CMP. We can take the tools that we've been able to, prepare and be able to actually have, actionable items that we can put on paper and say, here's how the state's going to be, managing these or being proactive for conditions or reactive. We want to be able to do that and let people have a better window into how this stuff works. So anyway, I think within a year and a half, when those plans are coming to be done, we'll hopefully have different strategies we can employ as part of those plans.
Yeah, and so I think thanks for those of you who volunteered for the working group. I think, continue to think about what does de minimis mean. I think another question, especially for the dischargers, is what does certainty look like? Is that just one fixed number? Is that a protocol? Because the lake is not fixed. So I think that's, what is helpful for you, for the operators to be able to make decisions too.
So, and one thing that Joe started with was the distinct economic impact of suspending plant discharge versus pond discharge, right? The rule seems to be generally, worded generally enough that can be a consideration, but maybe in the guidance, it's more explicit that there are distinct economic impacts of different discharge suspensions.
Great. Well, good discussion. Thank you, Bill. Let's move on. Christine, she's been working very hard to come up with new salinity estimates for this coming year. And I wanted to review that, and I think also at our last meeting, somebody, I think it was Thomas, brought up the question, that as we're looking at developing the engineering and new flow control structure for the Union Pacific Bridge, design and construction could take a year or two. And so what do we have the existing berm. We need to consider how we can use that in the intervening time. And so that was, Christine's been looking at, assuming the current berm, but I think as we meet this year, we need to keep that in the back of our mind is, what kind of a trajectory are we on, and do we need to kind of fine tune so that we're not in a reactive mode, but we're hopefully can be in a more proactive management mode.
Great. So keeping in mind where we are now, around 120 grams per liter, I'll start with just putting those values in the context of elevation and salinity. So starting to think about, when I think about forecasting, we know that volumes, mass, as well as salinity, they all kind of interact together. And so I remade this isomass plot that I have been showing in the past. On the x-axis or the y-axis, I used to have volume and salinity so that I could generate those lines, which are salt mass in the cell farm. Now I've remade it so that it's elevation on the y-axis, which may be more directly helpful and applicable to what we think about. So as you can see, all these different colored lines, they kind of represent different paradigms. As I always show, purple is kind of pre-new breach. After the breach is kind of in these green colors, and you can see that 2025, kind of over the last few months, starting in October 2024, those dark colors, we're just trending more and more to lower mass as well as to lower salinities. And so what this plot also allows us to do is then to kind of put bounds on this space. So the kind of the left and right blue lines represent 120 to 160 grams per liter, which this group has identified as the optimal range, and then the kind of the top and bottom bounds are just kind of what has been observed in terms of lake elevation over this period of record. So as Scott and I have been thinking about the utility of this plot and talking to Jeff about it as well, is really kind of the question looking forward is, let me just get a pointer, is how, as we plan and try to think about forecasting what might happen to the lake, how we can stay within this optimal range. It's about maintaining conditions where we have the most amount of buffer, I think. Understanding that there's going to be uncertainty from season to season, and any prediction of outgoing years, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, but how can we set ourselves up in any one moment to give ourselves the most buffer, if that makes sense? So that's kind of formulating where we are in the context of this happy place of this blue rectangle. And then I also kind of wanted to overlay what the healthy range identified in the commissioner's strategic plan is, 4198 to 4205. In the context of salinity and lake elevation, as you can see, it would require a lot more mass, salt mass, in that kind of condition. So I thought just kind of looking ahead toward those goals in the context of salt mass was helpful to me anyway. All right, so building on that to look at kind of more how salt mass has decreased, we can see from the color plot, we shifted toward lower salt mass. Here's a quantification of that starting in June of 2023 to the present. If we fit a linear line to that, it's about 0.4 million ton decrease per day that were being transported or removed from the south arm into the north arm via the breach. And our most recent estimates of salt mass from January 15th measurements were 885 million tons. So that's kind of where we're sitting right now. Since July of 2023, and I use that just because that's the period of time where I feel like we're pretty confident we can quantify fluxes through the breach, and where I've actually calculated these numbers. We've lost around 230 million tons being moved to the north arm. And what I think is really cool, so these are measurements from the lake. So Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program samples, measuring salinity, combining that with lake volume. That's what this plot shows. In addition to that, I also used a completely independent data set, which is our fluxes measured at the new breach. And I quantified that the salt flux through there is about 230 million tons as well. So that's pretty cool that those match up. We're measuring a decrease in the south arm that's consistent with what we're actually measuring at the breach being transported to the north. So that gives us confidence in these values. And then another question that Thomas brought up last time is, we were kind of at this happy place in the fall around 900 million tons. How much flow or flux would we need coming back into the north, from the north to the south? And so if I just take that kind of average rate of 0.4 million tons per day, the amount of flux that would be needed from north to south is around, or not flux, discharge, I'll say discharge, assuming 270 grams per liter would be around 600 CFS, just to give you some idea of the quantity of flow we need from north to south to have maintained the mass, in this case at 1,100 million tons.
And that's across the entire year, or?
Yeah, it's just an average. Yep. But I will point out that kind of, you can see how these, I have fit a linear line to it, but that's a biased fit, right? So there's points in time where we have higher rates, kind of a steeper slope, higher rates of decrease, and then it sort of flattens out, higher rates of decrease again. Those tend to occur in the spring, as you might expect. And that's consistent with this plot where I'm actually quantifying salt flux. These are at our different breach sites. We've got Lakeside in purple, the new breach from south to north in orange, the combined south to north export in black. And then I also added this just flux of north to south. I started thinking about, what that looks like. So as you can see, during spring, that's when we get a huge amount of export. That's also when Lakeside turns on, we get above 4193. And in this case, that's what happened in 2024. So then we kind of amplify the amount of salt exported through that second breach. And so thinking about, again, how much flux from the north would be needed to sort of counterbalance that. On January 8th, which is when we had a water quality measurement on that day, just to get equal flux in both directions, we would need 465 CFS coming back in from the north. And then I thought, all right, back in the fall was our happy place of 900. What would discharges look like over this whole period of time from north to south to have maintained it at that 900 million tons? And so this just gives you a sense of the seasonal variability of what that, well, actually, sorry, I guess I did this over the whole time, not just never mind, that was a little inconsistent. Basically, I quantified how much discharge from north to south would be needed over this entire period, which is June 2023 to the present, to have counterbalanced any changes in mass. And so just to give you a sense, we're dealing with around 400 to 1,400 CFS coming in from the north. So it's quite, it's a lot of mass. And as Ryan pointed out, our most recent measurements have been around 20 to 30 CFS. So we're well below that, but hopefully that's helpful to just give folks a sense.
Does that assume we still have the same south and north flow?
Yeah, well, it assumes this is kind of over what we observed. So over 2023 to 2024. Yeah, the variable flow.
Question
Yep.
for you or Ryan, is someone out there working on the equation of state for North Arm? The reason I ask that is because when we do analyses, both gravimetric PDS and some of ions, we're getting well over 300 for North Arm samples, but EOS is saying 270, something like that. Just
Yeah, it's a
thinking
good
that would
point,
change the
Andrew.
math
So
of this.
we do have an upper bound for that was updated a few years ago. And I forget, I think it is 200, around 270 grams per liter is the upper bound of that equation of state. So it has been extended. It may not be quite as high as what you are thinking. So yes, there will be error in the equation of state, I think, at a really high end. Yeah. It's a good
Because maybe it would take a little less flow, but the
Correct.
equation of state is not.
Yes, but I know we updated it and we have, for like some of the densities we've measured at the new breach, we're pretty confident in those values, and they have been validated at that high end. Yes.
Really hard to do an equation of state for above saturated where you have a mineral phase in addition to solvents dissolve. Those equations of state get really complicated and probably just fraught with error. And we're not working on that right now.
So yeah, what this kind of told me is that it's almost impossible to get that discharge coming back in the spring. In the spring, I think most often we're going to have South Arm coming up. You're going to have disproportionately be exported during the spring. You're just not going to get that back. The question is, can you then reinforce this part of the curve up, in the fall when we get more equalized head differences? But hopefully that gives you some sense of kind of just how much we need to move back into the south. Okay, so that brings us to the forecast. And I'll start by saying this is always difficult, but this time in particular, I fell into a few rabbit holes because the challenge is we have zero precedent to predict how the exchange at the breach is going to occur under the current berm conditions with this head difference. And so I really had to make some educated guesses here for what is coming back in. But I do think in the future, SOM is working on a rating curve with this current berm configuration to help us try to predict what those might be, but that just wasn't quite ready this round. So I will do my best to just go through this. The complicating thing this time, it's this conservation of mass equation that we always use, starting in January 15th, predicting what's going to be exported to the north, what's coming in via river inflows, and then what is also going to be coming in from the north to get at our spring prediction. And basically, we're kind of sitting in terms of South Arm Lake elevation, we're kind of sitting where we were this time last year. So what I did is I just kind of took the mean monthly from 2024 and applied that into the future, just as an average condition. And then for, wet, cool conditions, I kind of applied a factor to increase that. For dry, dry, warm conditions, then I applied kind of a frat, like 70% of what that would have been last year. So just to kind of adjust those scenarios, but everything else is kind of typical to what I do most of the time. And so I'll start with predictions for June. So ending on June 30th. The top one is probably not super relevant, but I just like to try to do it for myself. And that's the condition where we raise it right now. We get dilution in the South Arm based on kind of average precipitation, evaporation, and inflows. But then I'm not predicting discharge in a breach. I'm not predicting any inflow coming in from the north because I'm assuming it's just blocked off, although I did have to guess what's going through at Lakeside. And that puts us around 105 grams per liter. And then these kind of bottom three are different climatic conditions if we assume no change to the berm, that it's just as it is right now. And so we've got starting with average, warm, dry, we get higher salinities in the spring, and then wet, cool, we get more dilute. So a large range as always. And you can see kind of how the salt masses behave. with each of those. So if we get a lot of water, we move much more to the north arm as this bottom condition. Masses go down to 800. If we get a warm, dry, we're moving less water to the north, so masses are a bit higher in the south arm. So those are the kinds of fluctuations that might occur. And then for October, Jeff also asked me to kind of take it out to the fall. I did a similar, I did a similar exercise, average, and then for different climatic conditions. And for that, just extrapolating those conditions forward, I guess the challenge here is trying to guess when we're going to start to get north to south flow back. And my assumption is that we won't see that. The earliest we'd see that is in July, because I think we're going to have high elevations in the south arm. The elevation head difference between the two arms is going to continue to grow through the spring, and that we wouldn't start to see that decreasing until the earliest of July. So fall predictions around 90 to 130, and then these are kind of the same. The one thing that I changed here is to say, okay, let's come look at these bottom two scenarios. This is the 110 you saw before. Bottom one is like, what if we had 4 times the amount of flow coming in from the north? How would that change things? Not a whole lot on this 3 to 4 time scale going out to October. So it's not super sensitive to that on a 4-month-ish time frame, but obviously long term it will set the salt mass will change, and it will set us up for future conditions. So that are hard to predict. And then the last thing I'll point out is going back to this plot of how elevation, salinity, and salt mass relate to one another. This blue shape outlines where the spring 2025 predictions, that space of where it puts us. And then if I overlay the fall 2025, we're just shifting further. The salt mass is shifting kind of further to the left, and down, salinity is shifting down. And then I thought, as a group activity, we could all together guess where we'd be in spring of 2026 based on this trajectory. So I would assume we continue to go further to the left and sort of distance ourselves from that blue rectangle. So that's
great.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really good, Christine. And I just want to underline that your range in the predictions is not vast. It's important, the range that you get, but the most uncertainty in all this is what the climate's going to be, right? And we have no control over that. So the committee has a good tool, what Christine's doing, to advise on the rule, for example, right? But the other upshot from your work is that there is a circumstance, and we're in it now, where we need to preferentially bring back north arm water and not lose south arm water, right? We need to be able to open the gate from the bottom, right? This is something we thought unlikely 2 years ago, and we're already here. And the great news about that is that the change we made in raising the berm put a lot of money in the bank, and now we got to spend a little bit, so to speak. Right? I don't know if that analogy really works, but the point is we're in a good place if we can preferentially raise the north arm like that. So, but this is really useful, and I think the committee can really benefit from it and advise.
Christine, just to follow up on that, with the assumption that it's getting full mixing, can you remind me, just when you started looking at what you were actually observing going through the breach? I know there was a difference, but it wasn't as substantial as I think we all thought it could have been. But do you have any estimate about what, how much variation in the salt mass, like or total export, we would have seen if you observed, you know, concentrations that we saw last year where the Bear River was kind of short circuiting? Like what you might expect maybe the difference could be?
I think in those calculations, I think it was like something like, it was pretty high, like 40% different or something. Because yeah, this assumes complete mixing. It assumes all inflows are getting into the lake and there isn't a short circuit. I think after reworking that in my head and talking to Bill, I actually don't know if the way I did that was correct, to be honest, because it's really hard to quantify. So I'm going to say I don't know.
Okay.
And we need more work to do on that.
And then to even just to add on to that as well, you know, even considering the, you know, full mixing, we're taking into account that on some of the salinity calculations, we don't always have, homogeneous water column. So a lot of times, I think on the top of the surface, we have the fresh brines after rainstorms or whatever separation exists for a period of time. And so I think that like last year when we did these predictions, I think they were conservative in the sense that like full mixing really is never the case going through the breach. It's a lot of times through spring runoff, we're seeing, diluted brines go through there. So I just want to point that out because I do think that's something we have to think about. And I think it'd be really interesting to go back and look at the prediction you did last year. And not to say that there's anything, I don't think you can even take into account what I'm asking you to. I just think that like, it'd be interesting to understand that margin of error based on full mixing.
Definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that then. I think you're right. It's like, yeah, we need to come up with a way to get the full salinity profile across that opening for sure. And also it'd be great if we had more continuous data instead of monthly or every other month, so that we could actually just quantify that accurately. Because I do think it would be pretty dynamic. Like I imagine fluxes or discharge coming in from the Bear is going to make that breach water column salinity pretty variable and temporally dynamic. And so that's a great suggestion.
I think as we're fine tuning this whole management thing, like as Jeff will talk about this new structure and the analysis, I think if we need to ramp up the monitoring and have more frequent monitoring so we can better use the tools at our hands that way, I think that those are things that we should also start to discuss as a committee, just like where those gaps are so we can really be more diligent about what we have to do in the future. So that would love that would be on my knowledge. So there's folks out there that think that they could prescribe what we should be doing to be able to inform that better. I think that'd be really helpful.
We have some ideas.
Awesome.
Just point out, Christina used the technical term West crack.
It slipped.
The brine shrimp fishermen have this whole lexicon. Around it first, so that's pretty fun.
I like the term happy place too.
Happy place.
Yeah.
I think this is one of my new favorite charts.
Great.
So I think it's super powerful because I think we can see where we are today. It gives us an ability to think about what could be in the future and where we it provides us with the ability to say what do we think we need to do to get where we want to be. And so I think that's as we think about the flow through the bridge or the new breach, we're really going to need to start thinking about just what is the net flux, because we can try to turn off south to north flow to get all north to south flow. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but we may have to export water to the north to be able to get water from the north. We have to borrow from Peter to pay Paul. And I think that's where this net flux concept comes in, which I think your previous charts were showing is if we have a certain amount of south to north flow because of our head differential, the south arm is higher than the north arm. How much flow do we need from the north arm to counteract that?
And when thinking about net flux over what period of time, it's helpful to think about net flux, knowing that there's these hydrologic variations that are going to occur over the hydrologic cycle.
Have you tried dividing the salinities by the salt mass just to see how well these curves collapse? We're trying. I like this the way it is. But just do it just to see.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I wonder if Phil or John might comment just on how far left you have to go before we start to see ecologic impacts really on the average side from it being too fresh. For instance, where you start to see your impacts for brine butt.
I think we've talked about 90 is
where it starts to. 90's worrisome. I mean, it's kind of a black box in a way because we know 50 is a real problem. We know in literature that crixids can establish in some systems at 90. We don't have a good period of record for 50 to 100 Gilbert Bay to know exactly what's going to happen. So we get concerned, about 90. It starts becoming concerning.
Is there a seasonality to that? I mean, when you talk about Christmas, what's their life cycle compared to like a brine triplet or a brine fly? Would we be concerned about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, they're invertebrates, so they're fast. Things happen quickly, but I'm not sure how long it would take for them to establish and then really spread over such a large system.
So you're probably talking about a temperature.
Well, I'm thinking like, in the spring, if we're hitting 85 grams per liter, is that even remotely problematic, given the fact that we know that by the time, brine shrimp are at full swing, we're going to be up in the low 100s? Because I think we've determined over the course of this committee, again, like the seasonality of when we want to hit certain salinities related to, brine shrimp and brine flies, like a fall versus a spring kind of paradigm. And I would imagine Crixus would have like a similar.
So you need a spring box and a fall box.
I honestly think so, because I think that's pretty important, to be
Predation's
honest.
probably higher on younger brine shrimp stages, not by juveniles. The adults, I think, are a bit more resistant to it. So if I had to guess, I'd say, a high Crixus density in the spring when monopoly are hatching out would be a bigger problem than later in the year when you have a more robust adult population that might be able to withstand it. But that would take some digging.
I think that'd be really interesting to understand what the problem of low salinity is and when it occurs, so we can make sure that, we try to avoid that for that specific purpose. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to stay in the range, but understanding that better would be.
Anecdotally, I think it's kind of interesting, and this is pretty scientific, but normally you don't get Crixus counts in Farmington Bay, so you don't have established populations of brine shrimp. So if you're on the Farmington Bay side of the causeway, you won't see them. In 2022, when conditions were so bad, you saw brine shrimp cysts, adults on the Farmington Bay side. But as soon as the water levels return back, gone again. You see Crixus. So interesting.
And Christine, I think to Andrew's point, I think we should probably look at the differentiation, since we're labeling spring and fall here. Like, we know that 120 to 160 doesn't work if that's our target in the spring, because we're going to blast through our ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that
Okay.
I think would be helpful just to visualize this a little bit. But I like Jeff said, I love this chart too. I think it's really helpful to visualize it with our target goals and Tim's 2034 plan about what we got to do to get there and maintain salinity levels.
I just want to acknowledge that Phil Brown, he's developed this similar plot, right? And it's just
We're looking at similar relationships, we all understand this relationship between elevation, salt mass, and salinity. And so we've turned it and twisted it and looked at it in whatever ways make sense to us to understand it. But yeah, I mean, this type of relationship is really helpful, trying to see movement across both axes. So, yeah.
It is great. I think when we look at where we are today, at between, what was it, 800 and something million tons of salt in the South Arm, during the spring, the head differential is going to increase, and so flow to the North Arm is going to increase. And short circuiting might actually play in our benefit, because we'd be exporting less salt than if it was fully mixed.
Yep.
But I think, but if we aren't returning North Arm flow, that we might be bumping to the 800 million ton curve or potentially below. I guess your calculation shows we're getting close to it.
Below, yeah.
And I think that's where, this becomes a tool where we can start to think about, well, what do we need to do in the next 6 months or 12 months? Right now we're okay. And I think the projections for the summer are fine. And even this fall are okay. But I think when we start to look at where are we, if we look at it again in June or August and think about, well, what if we have a wet or dry or average winter next winter, now what could we do? Because I think what we're doing now in the next 6 months, we're still exporting salt to the North Arm without much import. So we're moving closer to that 800 million ton curve now, and we've got the buffer now to do that. But when the lake comes back up, right, Tim? Then, as Christine pointed out earlier, we are going to need more salt in the south arm. To be able, we're gonna have to bump up those curves to be able to stay in that blue box. And so that's where I think, right now it seems like if we close the berm in, close that V notch, that keeps and minimizes the amount that we export this spring. But even if we left it open now, we're still, it look like we're still in the acceptable ranges of salinity for later this year. But I think this summer is when we're gonna have to think about what do we need to do for, to prepare ourselves for next year. Because if we have an average winter next year, where that we raise that water level during the spring and export a whole bunch more salt to the north, we might be moving our, down to, closer to 700 million. And so those are, I guess that's where I think this chart, this concept is powerful, because we can really start to be looking at what is the salt mass. And Joe, you mentioned that earlier, just in context of, inflows as well as, are we in a paradigm where we need more salt or not?
Well, having kind of been in from day one on the voluntary agreements, kind of coming up with the design for how we regulate, that was based on an old paradigm. As I'm looking at it now, that's toggling lake elevation to kind of you kind of have in your mind, we all do, kind of pre-berm, what a salinity would link to a certain lake elevation over time. So the voluntary agreements were really structured towards lake elevation. I'm not saying that's wrong, but from a discharge standpoint, this is kind of a new element. Just thought, I mean, I'm asking half hour, possibly a new element to how we want to structure and regulate discharges. Because coming into this meeting, I would have assumed, okay, we're sitting at, we lost 3 feet, we're 4192. I would have thought that the mass load would have gone up, right? So then, the natural reaction from a discharge standpoint would be, okay, you might need to dial it down, but it's opposite.
And I think that, that's important, because, this committee, we don't look at surface elevation. We specifically look at salinity, but there's a whole lot of reasons that the elevation matters that, still tackle those voluntary agreements. But I think in this specific case, I think there's like 3 scenarios if we were thinking about any changes that we would need to look at. And one is, do we keep it the way it is and see what happens as we export salt? Do we raise it up so we can more intelligently decide how much salt we send? Or do we lower it down and allow the bidirectional flow to be established, right? Because I think if we're just now simply looking at it and saying what do we do if we export too much salt? I think there's a few different ways we could potentially manage that. And then at least in the most simplest version, I think the immediate would be the established bidirectional flow. But I think that also puts us at risk if we're entering another 10-year drought that maybe we bring back salt and we can't do it, right?
I do think, kind of talking about your paradigm idea, that I think the update of the matrix, the elevation matrix, will be critical for that too, with the comprehensive management plans. We've got a lot of data that we didn't, from the last 3 years, that we did not have, as it relates to elevations, relates to not just brine shrimp, but also brine flies. We're gathering more data over the next several years. I think all of these coming together will help enable us to better manage going forward, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. I think having both axes is really helpful, and having these new tools to be able to make decisions is great. Because Christine, USGS, Brian, I think that you guys have done a great job, and we just all need to continue to evolve as we get better data, better tools. And so a segue to a engineer tool that we need. And
I do want to thanks. I want to segue over to a new structure, because there's a lot of overlap with what we're talking about right now. As you know, we started work mid-November, looking at this flow control structure, and there's a number of folks at Jacobs who really kind of had to pile onto this to crank something out. Adam Nielsen is our project manager, and fortunately for him, he's on a, I can't remember how many years of wedding anniversary, but they had planned a cruise for this week a long time ago for a wedding anniversary. So he can't be here with us today. But he and a number of other folks have been really working hard to try to evaluate what our options are here. And so I'm going to try to, in the short time that we have, so earlier this week, I sent to the committee members a preliminary draft of our report that just really kind of talks through the concepts that we evaluated. It talks through a little bit, kind of highlights of the hydraulics, pros and cons of different options. But really, I think the important part of it is how we're trying to, what criteria do we use for the structure? Because that was probably one of our big challenges here. So I'm just going to touch on, our concept development, from our brainstorming session, how we landed on a selected design concept, which thankfully I think is consistent with what you were just presenting, Christine. There's a lot to the modeling that we could go into. We could totally geek out on that, but I think what's important is that I want to make sure you understand what we're actually proposing. So if we want to hear more details, we can do that. But we know where the project is. I'm going to kind of blow through some of these quicker. On November 11th, our team, we all went out. I think with Great Salt Lake, you can't really grasp this situation unless you're actually out there. So I thought it was important to get them out there, and we spent 6 hours hashing through things and decided this was dumb. It's too cold. Let's go somewhere warm.
You guys weren't very wrapped up.
No. And then but then we spent the rest of that day, the 11th, and all day, the 12th, talking about options. We did go look at the lakeside breach because we wanted to look at the pilings there as well. We were all amazed at the foam and how high the foam was up on the causeway from the north side. But I think some of the key things that we talked about were, what are we trying to design? So an engineer wants to draw a box around what do we need to do. And so, salt balance was really our primary motivation for the flow control structure. And we already know how to limit north to south flow, the berm. We're able to shut that off. And we know how we can export salt to the north arm by letting water go over the berm. But can we move salt back to the south? And that's actually what we were just talking about. And, how can we do that? Water level and flow control at the structure are the means to do that. We talked a lot about the harsh conditions out there, navigability, what paradigm should the structure be able to operate in? Low lake conditions are very different than high lake conditions. But we don't want to tear this thing out if the lake goes up and have to rebuild something. And that gets to the costs. There's our initial capital costs, expenditures, and then longer term O&M. And then, can we do this just once rather than having to come out and rebuild it? So in our brainstorming session, we started with the low lake level where we are today. We know the berm has worked really well. We talked about that. Is there a better way to reconfigure the existing berm? And yes, there are options. We've talked in this committee about concrete blocks. There's an inflatable berm option that could be implemented as well. Our memo gets into some of the more specifics, but the problem is that we can't limit the south to north flow. The only way we can do that is by limiting the inflow to the lake, and we don't want to do that. So, and the berm, whether it's made of fancy materials or not, it's going to limit the north to south flow. And so what the berm allows us to do is it allows us to have a net export to the north arm, which has been exactly what we needed to do in the last 3 years. So then we started to look at some additional what ifs. What if we need to export less to the north? We could raise the berm, like we were just talking about. Let's fill in that notch, or even raise the berm higher. That could, but then the water level gets higher, the volume gets higher. Now the salinity gets lower for the curves. What if we need to import more from the north? The berm won't allow us to do that. And so we looked at some options for how can we do that. And, can we put a culvert through the berm? These are really rough sketches that were done in our meeting. We talked about a adverse sloping culvert, because we could take advantage of the density differential and perhaps get more north arm water to go through. You look at it, you wonder how, but that's the way it works. Or can we get a siphon, to get water over the berm, and do that. And I think these are all good ideas, but we still can't limit that sort of south to north flow. That's just, we're beholden to the inflows to the lake. And we can increase the flow to the south, but we were, I guess our tummy rub was, we thought, well, we need 700 to 900 CFS of north arm water to get to the south arm. And through culverts, we just didn't think we could do that. All of these options would require valves, and just with corrosion. And I think one big topic that really ended up driving our design is just the problem of salt incrustation. So I guess wish there was a better word for it. But frankly, with north arm water at or near saturation, salt crystals wreak havoc with anything mechanical. And so we had to address that. So this, when we think about what's happening in the south arm, when this really is just another way to look at, illustrate the curves that Christine was showing, is that as the lake goes up, we're going to need more salt. We're going to have to import salt from the north. As the lake drops, we're into a paradigm where we're exporting salt to the north. And so that's, from Christine's curves, that's what we see here. And I think, where we've been, between 88.5 and 92.5, that curve at 900 million tons allows us to be, right in that sweet spot, of 120 to 160, that lower red line. If we want to be at a higher lake level, from 92.5 to say 97, we're going to need 1,200 million tons. So we're going to have to, 50% increase of salt in the south arm if we want to maintain the lake between 92.5 and 97. So what this was really made it very clear to us was that, wow, the crux of this is really, how do we get north arm water to the south? And, because we're still exporting salt over the berm, we need to somehow, if we want the lake to go higher, we're going to have to get more salt in the south arm to maintain that range. So our, conclusions were basically that the berm has been great. It's great at low and falling lake levels. But when we start to get, if we need to control that south to north flow, the berm just doesn't do it, and we need a different structure. If we need north arm water in the south arm, again, the berm or any configuration of the berm doesn't get us where we need to be. So we need to do something different. And so
really sure on that. I mean, if you say deepen the top, get bidirectional flow, if it's wide enough.
It's a matter of how much flow do we need to go south. Right now we have 20 to 30 CFS coming over the berm or through the berm.
You deepen that to, I don't know, 3, 4, 500.
Right.
Obviously that's not 600, but on a longer time scale, it gets you
Just wondering.
It-
Let's look at the phase one raise, got it to 4189. We were still spilling over, as I recall, north to south.
June to June 20, or when we raised it to in July 2022.
Yeah.
I think we cut off north to south flow pretty quick with that, from what I can remember.
I think I've got some, we were thinking about that because, and I think this is where, when we think about the berm that we have now, you know, if we were to tear the berm out completely, we would get a much more robust bidirectional flow. But I think we would still have a net export of salt to the north. So we would reduce that net flux. You know, now we're exporting 200 some million tons.
But you're still in an export.
And so we would reduce that from 200 to maybe 50 or 100, but we're still losing ground. So that actually really led into our modeling, how we started the modeling. So did you have something else?
Well, I just wanted to point out that at higher lake elevations, you also have lakeside. So you also have like a second breach that is pretty much always exporting. So that north to south flow Jeff's talking about is compensating for both of those.
Right, exactly.
And that one won't flow both directions unless you get really hot.
In the north.
And that flow correlated with the rapid export of salt in 2024 when that opened up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things that one of the hurdles we had to mentally get over was the fact that this structure is just one valve in a big complicated system. And so we want a valve that can do as much flexibility as we can. We have to understand how it's working with the lakeside breach, how it's working with inflows to the lake, and all of that has to work together.
Yeah, the missing link though is the hydraulic head differential between the south and north arms. And I'd like to see this discussion with that explicit, right? Because that's what's controlling flow between the arms. And some judgments are being made where I'm not sure that's true if you consider the hydraulic head differential, right? So it's got to be explicit.
Yes, and I'll touch on that. Okay. You're exactly right. I mean, this is all about head differential and density differential and
suspense is killing me here.
Yes. So sorry. So where we went to was, okay, if we need to control flow going in both directions, we really need to have a wall structure where we have gates, where we can control water going underneath, but also over. And we had a single wall structure, you know, and I guess where we landed was it would likely be where the existing berm is. We talked about a double wall structure. There might be some benefits there. You know, we were thinking about, you know, maybe that would help diffuse the north arm brines a little bit better and reduce the debrine layer. Two walls obviously means more money, more operations. So, and then we had some, you know, the big what ifs. It's interesting in 1970 that when they were really starting to recognize the salinity differential, they were actually talking about relocating or moving the Bear River into the North Arm. And, you know, obviously that has some serious implications. You know, relocating the West Desert Pump Station to pump North Arm brine over, that would help us get salt load into the South Arm, opening up the causeway and really increasing that bidirectional flow. We didn't spend much, if any, time on those. Just that was frankly outside the scope of what we're talking about. But we went through an exercise. I won't go through this chart. And where we landed was on that single concrete flow control wall. And so it has 5 bays. Each bay is 16 feet wide. The actual gate, with, you know, once you subtract the frame, it's probably about 14 feet wide for each gate. And I'll talk about what that'll, you know, walk you through the tour in a little bit. To get there, but really another key challenge is this going to work? Can we actually get North Arm water going south and control water going in both directions? So we started with just and this isn't done very often. I think Sam's model has been great. And so we started from his model, but what we wanted to do is we changed to a different modeling platform, and I'm blanking on the name of it, just because that's our modelers use that every day and are able to very easily run it. And our servers, are all configured to run very, efficiently there. But we wanted to make sure that the physics could work. So we wanted to look at fundamental validation. We need to look at historical data, practical validation, and then really looking at the structure itself. This hypothetical situation where we have a nozzle discharging hypersaline water into other hypersaline water is something we wanted to do just to validate that the model is doing things correctly. And so we did it for different scenarios. And what we were really trying to get at is the computational fluid dynamics model, the CFD computer model, agreeing with experimental fluid dynamic models. So actual experimental data. And that's where this nozzle was great, because people have actually done this in a lab. And there's a lot that we could talk about here too, but generally they matched up pretty well. We looked at exceedance curves because we were trying to gauge, well, where, what water levels should we be looking at? What density gradients should we be looking at? And what you see here is just the exceedance, where the south arm has been in the last 20 years. So what you'd see here is that 50% of the time, the lake has been at or below, 4194.5. That's the median. And similarly for the head differential, we see that the head differential has been median value is about 0.7. And those were, what do we look at where do we even start with the modeling? And there's all kinds of fun stuff here. This is just actual USGS data, trying to look at when we raised the berms, when we made modifications, looking at south arm head differential flows in either direction. Don't have time to go through that now. But then we looked at density versus lake level, because we need to understand this density differential is important as well as the head differential. And this was, I thought was slick, just showing, it's not from a hydrology perspective, this is a great correlation. We don't often have great correlations like that. But then for the north arm, same kind of thing. Looking at when do we have saturation, that's why the line drops to off, and with measurements that we have in the north arm. So when we started to build the model, we wanted to make sure we built and we talked with Sam Data at USU. He was great in providing all of his data, his model, etc. But what we talked about is we need to make sure that we can calibrate our model, in the same way as he calibrated his. And so we started with the original survey data from August 2021 that HDR provided to the state, or Union Pacific provided to the state. And this is just, looking at different elevations. And I think one thing that really struck us is that this is that north berm that that Union Pacific built as part. That was what they intended to build. But and this is back in 2016. But what we see is that there's actually some other berms that have been created or are artifact of construction, where we have this another south berm, and actually another berm to the south that's even higher than the constructed berm that Union Pacific put in. And so that becomes important when we start to look at, well, how can we maximize that north arm flow? Because those berms actually do slow down the flow. We modeled where we started was we wanted to calibrate the model to the best measurements that USGS has made, cross sections, the longer term data sets that they have and that was where we started before we started monkeying around or changing the berm. And so this just shows, on the left, flows going to the north and flows going to the south, and red, bright red means it's north arm water. bright blue is going to be entirely south arm flow. And so you can see as the water is flowing along the surface, it's starting to mix into the north arm. That at the bottom of the lake per se, we see that north arm water move through. And I think one thing that impressed us too is just the velocities that we're seeing. Because if I go to this next, again, this is pre us changing the berm. What we see is what we measured. But what we start to see is higher velocities down along the bottom, and actually a hydraulic jump that forms right where we're measuring velocities. So I know we talked, I think you guys, well, I know you guys have struggled with, why get better velocity measurements. And I think part of that is because we have a lot of turbulence going on. As water is going over that berm, it's creating an underwater hydraulic jump, and likely scoured out some of that material and placed it into another berm on the south side of the bridge. So some things we learned there. But we, for a calibration, we looked at, the red is what our velocity profile from the model was at. The green is and blue are field measurements. And one thing we talked about is that, there's just uncertainty in the measurements that we have. There's uncertainty inherent in the modeling that we're doing. And so we felt like, the velocity profile agreed well enough with the field measurements, given all the uncertainties that we needed to proceed. We couldn't keep monkeying around with that.
As a first cut, yeah, that is really useful. But those density elevation relationships are going to separate according to salt mass, just like what Christine's diagram showed, right? So you could fine tune it using that.
Yep.
That's great.
Right. So then what we wanted to do is, well, how can we control these flows? And here we're trying to explore, the density differential, the head differential, what's really happening out there. And so one thing our modelers did is, we started out with a full CFD model of the whole site. That takes significant computational resources and time to run those models. And what we found was that if we actually take one 7-foot slice, north-south slice through the breach, that runs significantly quicker, and also matched up quite well with what the full model did. And so that made us significantly more efficient and be able to run a lot more different scenarios to try to understand what's going on. So what this is just showing, on the right is the north arm, and the left is the south arm. If both arms are at the same lake level, if we insert a gate, we can create entirely north to south flow. The density differential is controlling the flow there. If we start to add head differential where the south arm is 1 foot higher than the south arm, we hit this critical point where the south arm is wanting to start to push back into the north arm. And actually at that head differential of about 1.5 feet, we actually see the north or the south arm is pushing through that structure and into the north arm, and actually is starting to slow down or constrict how much north arm water is moving south. So again, this is still hypothetical. We're trying to understand what's really happening here. And so this is just showing rates of flow and or velocities in the colors, and just trying to again explore what's going on there. So what this led us to, again, back to the concept is, if we have a single wall structure where we have 2 gates, one gate is really creating an orifice or an opening at the bottom to control that north to south flow. We have another gate that's really serving as a weir where we can raise and lower that, so we can control the water going to the north. And for south to north flow, head differential is what drives that. For north to south flow, both head and density differential drives that flow. And so we need to manage these things together. And really where we started to get was, what is the desired net flux? What do we really want to do in terms of pushing water in one way or the other. And so, that's where, they were like, okay, give us, Jeff, give us 5 conditions that you want us to design this thing for. And I'm like, okay, well, reading the tea leaves is we're probably going to need to import salt in the next few years if we can really get the lake level up. So we need to make sure we can do that. We need to get that north to south flow. But we also want a structure that's applicable as the lake goes up. We don't want to rip this thing out because we didn't think about it, higher lake levels either. And so, but at the same time, our modelers are doing this, our structural and mechanical engineers are looking at how do we actually build something to do this. And so what you see here is 2 gates, 2 independent gates that would move up and down. Where we started to, but some of the challenges that we identified, yes, it'd be great to have better flow criteria. Really what I said is I want a structure that can do it all. We need something that's flexible, something that's adaptable to changing conditions, because I think if we learned anything is that the lake is not predictable. And so we need to have something adaptable. Corrosion is a concern. It was overshadowed by other things. But what we've learned in other industrial applications, and I think even we had a long, great conversation with Mark Reynolds, and his experience was similar to what we've seen in other industrial locations, is that, yeah, we can design some fancy structures with unique materials to combat corrosion, but it's cheaper just to design to replace it. In locations, some industries will just replace valves every month because that's cheaper, far cheaper than trying to build something that can last for a long time. So you're just trying to balance what is the long-term operations cost versus initial capital costs. And I think, wave forces were a significant concern. We talked to Jim Cross. He sent a picture of enormous waves in the North Arm, that were going over a barge. He said that one of their barges ended up on top of the railroad at one point. So that kind of freaked out our structural engineers, like, my God.
Send that picture out.
Yes, I put it in the draft, but yes. So waves are a significant concern. And so are we going to build a structure that can handle all these wave forces, or what can we do? Soils are a concern. The one geotechnical study that we have from Union Pacific is unfortunately where they saw, the most settlement on their causeway, 10 feet in a week. So that panicked our geotechnical engineers. What are we going to do for that? But I think what I wanted to highlight is this salt incrustation is the biggest concern, because what we've learned from Compass and others is that, they have to exercise their gates daily if they want to keep these things operational.
There's 2 forms of that too. Just the normal salt incrustation that you can expect, but also water salts. Like when you start playing around with velocity in cold temperatures, that's a whole different problem. And just other tops.
What'd you call it?
Water salts. It's a magnesium.
Probably.
Yeah. And that forms a Barron's Trench in a heartbeat. You can block it off. Yeah. It is typically in a winter.
Okay. So when the mechanical engineers were like, how in the world, we don't have something where we've dealt with these things before. And so 2 gates is more moving parts. The state does right now have anybody who can go out and move gates every day. And so we came up with, well, let's have 1 steel panel that can be replaced frequently. It's designed, we think that the gates will probably only be adjusted seasonally. once to maybe 4 or 5 times a year. And so it's cheaper to actually buy a new steel plate and cut it to shape for that season than it is to try to replace the structure. So over time, the state could develop a library of gate panels that they can switch in and out. But the idea is that that's long-term is going to be cheaper. So the quick tour, time is it?
So Jeff, is it 2 openings in 1 panel or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
2 openings, 1 panel. So we can control, so we could close the bottom with a deeper panel. So we only get south and north flow. We could do the inverse of that. We could, but in terms of the structure, as I mentioned, there's 5 bays with those gates, supported by wing walls. Our design right now looks at concrete walls, but given the soil conditions out there, it may be cheaper just to put galvanized steel sheet piles in there and replace those every 10 years than it is to try to build expensive concrete with enormous pilings that need to be driven very deep down into the lake. Another thing that is to dredge the channel down at 4170 or 4178. That would help significantly on that north to south flow. We've included new pads on either side, so it's easier to park vehicles, and more importantly, we didn't want to put motors out there, automated gates, because those will just corrode. So we think it's cheaper to rent a large crane once in a while and raise and lower the gates than it is to build something that's just going to sit there for months without being used. In terms of waves, the concept right now is that we would put wave breaks out to reduce that energy rather than trying to design gates that can handle this. It's cheaper to put rock, and actually we think it might even be cheaper still to use sheet piling. It's certainly not it's not pretty, but sheet piling is cheaper and isn't going to be subject to sinking into the lake bed. The gate, this is the gate structure looking to the south, and these different colored gate panels just kind of illustrate how, I guess, to answer your question, Bill, is that the gates could be shaped, have different dimensions. The opening there would be a weir. The gates would be set at different elevations to allow whatever water we want to come to the south. And the little contraptions you see on the top are, these gates are not just, they're going to be heavy, but they're not just going to fall by themselves to exactly where we want to go. If there's water pushing them, and so they're going to need to be vibrated or pushed down to where we want them. And so we're thinking that we can put vibrators on tops of the panels to allow them to fall down to where we want them to be. But those are 4-foot wide concrete piers. And one of the things for corrosion is any penetration into concrete is a way for the concrete to crack and for salt water to get to our rebar. Most concrete in this condition is going to likely fail from inside rather than from outside. And so we wanted to minimize our penetrations into the concrete. And so the gate frames are literally sitting there by gravity and connected, only bolted in at the top. And I'll show you that just a second here. This is looking crosswise, so looking to the west. The frame that we came up with is intended to be removable because of the salt incrustation, and I think the glauber salt you just mentioned, probably, I think we have to think through that, but we were thinking North Arm water could very well lock this thing up, and we don't want to have to tear concrete out to put a new gate in. So we want a gate that we can pull out if we need to. And so this is a unique design where there's 2 very large concrete boxes on either side of the gate. There's a 3-inch steel plate that sits on a concrete curb on the bottom. it's just there by gravity. It plugs a curb, so it's not going to move upstream or downstream. It's 3 inches of steel is just going to sit there. But then these two boxes in the pink that you see there are intended to be sit down and fit onto the bottom plate. And the idea is that if if we do have a lockup where the gates are stuck to one of the frames, is that we can detach the frame at the top where it is anchored, bolts, and we can pull the frames in either direction and pull the thing apart and pull the whole thing out. Someone have a question? I don't.
Elliot was saying something about the mirabolite.
Oh, yes.
Dissolve when it hits the south water.
Yep. So I'll get to that. That's the other idea that we have. So the idea is that this gate and this is so what this is looking east-west. This is looking at where that big box frame. So what you see here in the pink is this big box frame. I think it's 24 inches by 8 inches, just thick steel. That frame is going to sit down. The green here on the bottom is that bottom plate. So it's sitting on top of a concrete curb by gravity. On either side, it has these really thick steel pins that are welded to that bottom plate. So what those box frames actually sit down on top of those pins. That's what keeps the frame from going upstream or downstream. And we don't have any bolts. It's something that is going to sit there and it holds it laterally. And if we need to, we can pull it off. We're going to, this interstellar space here is going to be filled with, I don't remember what this, a fancy wax that it would just be completely full, and they would push it down onto the pins and it would squirt wax around it. And so we would have less, the idea is we wouldn't have salt water inside of it. But what this allows us to do is if we can't pull the gate up or down, we could actually go in and detach either one of these box frames from the top, and we can pull it to either direction to pull it apart. And if we needed to, we can just pull the whole thing out. And then the gate itself, and this is the other critical component with the north arm water versus south arm water, is we know that Compass and others have to flush their pipes and their pumps with less saline water to dissolve any salt that's accumulating. So how can we do something like that here? This
Solid brine works.
Yes, and that's what we intend to use because we don't have fresh water here. So the idea is we have, I call it strategic leakage, but we've got a 1/2 inch gap around the gate. So water is always flowing around the edges of the gate. There's little steel knobs every 4 feet that keep it from being in full contact with any parts of the frame. But that we didn't think that was enough. And so what we've also designed is a diffuser system. There's a channel that's built into this one frame structure where we would actually take south arm water by gravity. It would float down either side of the frame. And there's little 1/2 inch holes that are in the frame itself where that south arm water can come in and basically keep the gate in south arm water on the north side. And the same thing is on the south side. These are details that'll have to be hammered out during next phases of design. But when we used the CFD model to look at would this work hydraulically? And yes, we have to move the diffusers on the bottom further to the north because of the high velocity flow that's going to be going through that if it's open. But we can keep that flushed with south arm water and hopefully minimize salt incrustation. Hopefully, I don't know if it addresses the globber salt issue, but if the theory was if we can try to keep south arm water around the gate panel where its contact point, That's our first line of defense. If it does lock up, we can pull this whole thing apart, and it still takes some force to do so, but we can do that. And so from an operations standpoint, there would be a crane that would be able to lower the gates in, and they would be attached by cables at the top. And I think, and I guess the diffuser system, there'd be an intake on the south arm with a pump. There'd be a diesel tank that would have to be up there. We need two pumps to make in case one fails, and then there'd be a tank. The pumps basically just keep the tanks, optimize the energy which is required to keep the tanks full, and then by gravity it diffuses the south arm water around the gates. So I think that's the very, very, very quick tour. But I think what really drove this was we need to be able to import north arm water. You know, the berm is a great solution now and in the short term, but if our efforts in the watershed are successful and we're able to get more water to the lake, or if we get another great winter, we're going to need more salt. And so how can we get that north arm water through? And that's really what pushes to the single wall structure. And then a lot of the other details were just how do we balance this in a way that it's functional in the near term paradigms of lower lake levels. You know, how could the state, you know, if we needed to and the lake got back up above 4,200, you know, what could we do? So there's a lot there, and I think the next steps, you know, what we're doing in terms of the cost estimate, you know, it's not a cheap structure, and I think our cost estimate right now is heavily influenced by our uncertainty as to the soils. The pilings that are required to keep it from settling, sinking down into the lake, but also to be able to support it laterally from waves. You know, there's 85 piles driven at 200 feet, you know, that's the conservative design. And that represents over 60% of the cost of this thing. But I guess the current estimate is 40 million. The structure itself is only 15. But you know, you add the piling and now we're up to 40. So then so what that tells us is, okay, there's, you know, our engineers are having to be conservative because there's a lot of uncertainty in the criteria. So a geotech investigation is a critical thing to know what are the soils actually going to be here. That'll help us reduce the costs on the pilings. You know, we'd love to be able to validate the gate diffuser concept. Does that keeping south arm water around the steel elements, will that work in the different conditions that we see in the lake? It would be great to be able to say, you know, to be able to look at the lake modeling. You know, do we need the structure right now? It's going all the way. It's as tall as the bridge, the Union Pacific Bridge, because we want to make sure it's navigable. But we could probably lower that if we don't need to control bidirectional flow at high lake levels. You don't maybe need a structure that goes that high. So there's a number of things, you know, site survey, we have.
Jeff?
Yes.
Because you're pretty far down in the weeds on this, and it's a really interesting concept. But the alternatives, like stacking concrete blocks, were eliminated up front. When in fact, if you arrange them correctly, you can get preferential flow from the bottom, blocking flow on the top, and
Similar to the culvert.
eliminate a whole lot of geotechnical and other concerns that you're addressing with this. So
Similar to the culvert concept where we're getting
similar, but yeah, similar to the culvert concept. But you know, the point is that some simpler structures were not really considered. And I think a cost analysis of those alternatives, because they are more labor intensive if you're using concrete blocks.
I think the more important question with that, and the reason, and the primary reason we moved away from a berm whether it's concrete blocks with openings or culverts or those kinds of things, was that we need to import a lot of water to the south. And,
You need a lot of brine from the north.
a lot of brine from the north to the south. And I think, you know, with the gate that we have here, if you know, if I remember right, one of the scenarios is if we can maintain a 1/2 foot differential, head differential, we could move 900 CFS to the south.
And I argue that you can do that with concrete blocks. And there needs to be a comparative analysis of the costs.
Okay. I think, yes, but I think the question that I would love to have is from the salt balance that, you know, that we're looking at is what net flux do we need to have in the different lake level conditions? Because if the net salt flux, how can we have a net salt flux to the south if we're not controlling the south to north flow?
You can do that
Can we do
with concrete blocks. That's the thing, is that assumption that you can't do that with blocks was made up front, and I don't agree with that.
Okay.
You can
Well,
leave
let's-
openings at the base. And agree, it's technically far, rudimentary. But it comes with a lot of flexibility.
Oh, no, I think it's a capacity question.
I
How much water do we?
But the cost also becomes a driver because I mean, the thing that I think big picture, view from 10,000 feet is just moving rocks. What can you get done? Just moving concrete blocks. What can you get done? Sophisticated solution. What can you get done? But then the reality, controlling for salinity is the most important thing we can do, I think, in this system. But the reality is the way the legislature allocates money is if they that 30 or 40 million dollars, it's not like it's going to just materialize from something. It's going to come from a pot of resources that could otherwise go to water supply or any number of other things. And so it just really gets upon a premium on making sure that we really dial it down. It does not say it may be where we need to go, but we want to be pretty dang sure.
I recall back in, when UP was designing the bridge, coming up with, it was moved so far west, and the logic was there's better lake bed soils, more competent. It feels like they should have a geotech library. Not that would be sufficient for this structure, but it's, it would be informative.
Yeah, we asked and they sent us the one, and I asked them, is this what you use for the bridge? And they said yes. And that's just the reason why their piles are down 200 feet. So we, at least at this stage, we assume a similar strategy. And it is conservative at this point, but at this level of design, the goal is to investigate, identify what our criteria are, and
The weights would be different. I mean, there's according to train. Not that this is light.
Yeah, and I guess the other thought I had was, we know we can get northern water back to the south if it's completely open. We saw that after 2016 and the head differences came back.
Pretty rapidly, it seems like.
Yeah, it was, in that case, we had a 3-foot head difference, I should say elevation difference. And then within 6 to 8 months, we were starting to see it coming back. So I think another consideration is that you can get a lot of northern water back to the south, but you need to consider the time lags depending on what the head difference is.
oh, and you're exactly right. I think that if we we're kind of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, we have to get water to the North Arm to have a low head differential. And so we have to export water to the north to be able to get water back from it. And and it can work given the density differential. But how do we operate the lakeside breach in conjunction with this to push water to the north on a seasonal basis where we can have a low head differential, and then you know, with a gate like this, we can block off that south to north flow and then, you know, and then maximize the north to south flow.
Yeah, it's
And,
maximum
and I think,
flexibility.
and I think, Bill, you're absolutely right, is we can, you know, that's, you know, I think you know, the culverts are a similar concept where we have a mechanism to get north arm water through a structure and have some control of that, over that. And I think our concern was that we're not going to have the capacity, you know, with obstructions in that north to south arm flow section, is that we wouldn't get enough capacity. And I think which comes back to the importance of the lake model is if we're able to look at, you know, the full picture like you've been doing, you know, how much water do we need to move to the north, you know, to be able to bring water back to the north arm and bring it back, and when do we do that? And so I think so, you know, yes, you know, this concept covers a huge, you know, spectrum, and to be able to be flexible and adaptable for the huge range of conditions and what we want to do, it's expensive. And so I think it is worth looking at, you know, are there ways that we can, you know, do something more temporary, you know.
Yeah, and you said the concern is not enough capacity, but that needs to be shown. I mean, first of all, you know, who makes the decision on what is the capacity that's needed? Because are you trying to solve the problem here? Or you're going to let it be solved over summer, right? Probably the latter. And so that issue has to be explicit. And how do we decide what's sufficient capacity?
We don't know that.
Well, but we can be explicit about the assumptions of it. And my guess, it is a guess, is that a block structure can be addressing an issue over a full period.
And I mean, one thing we looked at too was, I mean, for $500,000, we can put a small pump station out there and just pump north arm water under the railroad tracks, and move 60 million tons a year. You know, 2 CFS just plug away. It's going to have to be maintained, but that's a cheap solution where we can have a structure like this, but have a way to pump north arm salt back to the south. So there are things that that we can do, you know, and I guess that. So anyway, that I think we're over time here, but I guess what I would love to do, I guess the next steps is, you know, would love comments on what I sent out. You know, I'd love to talk more with questions you have, or if you have information that shows some, you know, that, you know, some of these other concepts can work. But I think this was, you know, I guess this is where we are. We're finalizing our hydraulics memo, working on that. That'll be added to this report to better document the modeling work that was done. Hoping to meet with Craig and Sam in the next week or two to review that one last time. So anyway, but I think if I had my top wish item would be to know how much water that you need to move, and when, and, you know, and develop some of those key criteria.
Can I just, I think this is really amazing that you thought of all these different things and all the challenges that exist out there. And it seems like a very clever solution. And like what it seems to buy this whole situation is maximum flexibility of being able to adjust those flux on a really short time frame. Whereas if we build in something like concrete blocks, or if you can just go back to a rockfill causeway, then you're dealing with 6 to 12 to 18 month planning and anticipating what's happening. Whereas yours kind of is just like, you know, we don't have to anticipate as much because we can control it more. So I think that's important to keep in consideration. Like you're investing in something, it would be an investment in maximum flexibility to adapt. And does this system, which is we can determine how predictable it is. Does it need that degree of flexibility, or are there other options where we can combine planning with a simpler option? I don't know, but this is super cool to learn about. I think you guys.
This would be a good metric for the committee to kind of consider is what is the flexibility needed to be able to have some control over the system? What is our target? Because that you've shown in your modeling that the actual annual export import through the opening is not the primary driving force, you know, it's secondary to all the other things going on. And so
For salinity.
for salinity, so
Yeah, I mean, that's my best analogy I can come up with is this is one small valve in the system. And it can certainly be really helpful. It gives us more options and flexibility and respond to condition. Flexibility, adaptability. I think those are the things. I guess those are, you know, I mean, even the discussion earlier in the meeting with all of these different things that are going on, all these different planning efforts, different things that we're considering, they all fit together, and they're not all fit together yet. There's still pieces on the table that we're identifying them. We're learning how they can fit together, but we haven't come up with those numbers. And so I think that's where, I know as engineers, then if we don't know, then we need flexibility. Otherwise, we start making we can't make assumptions on our own. We need that input. So I think if my wish list would be to be able to use the lake modeling to really identify, how much water we actually do need to move in different lake conditions. So then we can optimize the design and make it cheaper.
And just wanted to say as well, we asked JP to have this done by February 15th in case there's some appropriation that could be had, right? This analysis. So we don't have a ton of time. I think also to Tim's point, we want to be fiscally responsible and find something that will meet the needs, of the lake with also, maximum flexibility. And I don't think we're going to have a ton of cracks in this. Tim, maybe you have a better insight into this, but there's the POR funding that was just used that I think we potentially consider tapping into, remaining ARPA funding. And I think a lot of these things are going to go away. And I don't know what it's going to look like to be able to fund something at a large scale again. And if we don't get it right this time, I also don't think that we'll have another chance to go back and redo something. So I do think it's a really important field to explore that, because I think there's options, right? We could just continue to operate with the firm. Maybe that's good enough. We can just put that back and forth, and that's going to meet the needs. Even just removing it all the way will allow the bidirectional flow to reestablish. But then there's the blocks and maybe the Cadillac version, which is maximizing that. But I think we do need to do our diligence and make sure that there is truly a difference between the Cadillac version and
yeah, I think you pointed to the pump. What can that move compared to what we've been moving?
And there's also just, off the top of my head, I was thinking Compass has a facility there on Promontory that they do some washing, and not to put Joe on the spot, but I mean, Compass has stepped up to the table and been a partner in other ways. And I wonder if there's, partnerships that could be had and using existing facilities to look at, pumps that have big volumes to see if there's a way that, the state could, fund some portion of the upkeep maintenance or something. But those are the kind of things.
I thought of the same thing.
Yeah. I mean,
when that was mentioned, pump station 1, it's not operated all year.
Exactly. And so if you can operate at the time of year where it's, where you guys aren't needing it, if we could somehow contribute to that, I think there's ways that we could get, really creative.
Just because you get adjacent to the south arm and we have that pump station 23, you could, wouldn't take a whole lot of work.
I mean, those are the kind of things that I think that right now, if we can, think outside of the box a little bit, I think we could determine whether we need to invest everything into the structure or if there's other ways that we could combine these. And I think you guys would look in, like Christy said, you guys have done a great job really honing on what the project was, which is what can we do in the bridge. I think as a group, we narrowed the scope to exclude all of the other things, the other ideas on the causeway, because we wanted this focus on this. So I think your job is to provide us with that. And then I think that what the state and what others will need to do is look at that and decide, is, you know, if it ends up being $30 million or something, is that the cost that we're willing to put into that? Or are there other, you know, more economical solutions that we can investigate, like, you know, through other. So anyway, I just want to say that I think you guys have done a great job, but there are a lot of things to consider here before, you know, anybody starts writing a $30 million check. Sure.
Well, good. I guess I'll take my hat off on the engineering, back to the committee. Are there any other, I guess, a couple of action items that we have is, one is, you know, committee members, please review that report and send me comments. I mean, these are exactly, I mean, I think we have time where we could, you know, we discarded the culvert thing because we didn't think it was moving enough water. But I think if we can, but I think those kinds of comments, we can make sure we address those in here. And so that would be number one. We have to submit our final stuff to Forestry by February 15th. So that's 3 weeks away. So ideally, if in the next week, if you can get me comments, and then I think other action items is, Jim, on your working group, we'll get a meeting scheduled for probably a month from now to talk about the new rules there. And we'll look at scheduling a meeting with the committee in April. I don't know. Yeah, was that March? Or March?
Do you guys need to submit by April?
By April 1st.
So I think we need to meet probably, early March.
So we usually meet on so maybe March 20th or 27th, that's Thursday. Or 27th, or I guess 13th or 20th, I think. Water users is
water users.
the 20th.
So maybe the 17th or 19th.
So maybe the, oh yeah, that's right.
The 20th. The 13th or 20th. I'll just shoot out a doodle poll and you guys can tell me.
13th would work.
What's that?
13th would work best. I think you can schedule.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Oh.